Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, JSSJ. If you're passionate about justice, equity, and inclusion, and you're looking for a distinctly Jewish lens, USF's graduate-level JSSJ certificate program offers a powerful opportunity to grow your impact and deepen your practice. This summer, dive into disability and Jewish social justice with none other than Julia Watts-Belzer, author, advocate, and past Judaism Unbound guest, exploring how we build truly accessible, inclusive communities rooted in Jewish values. Applications are open now through May 27th. Learn more and apply at usfca.edu/JEDI. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 482, Intergenerational Jewish Trauma. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg, and today I'm bringing you the intro, which Dan normally does, but don't worry, he is still here for the episode. It's just that I'm kicking things off. We're energized for a conversation with Tirzah Firestone, a rabbi, psychotherapist, and author who has done brilliant work exploring intergenerational Jewish trauma. This episode builds off of our conversation last week with Brent Spodek, and is also in conversation with our recent unit of episodes exploring American Jewish discourse about Israel-Palestine. For years, intergenerational Jewish trauma has come up on our show in the context of other themes or units, but we wanted to take a couple episodes now to explore it as our primary subject, which is what led us to these conversations with Brent Spodek and Tirzah Firestone. Before we dive in, a couple quick reminders about Judaism Unbound programs that are coming up. First, although not first chronologically, but first, Shavuot Live is back! Our 24-hour extravaganza of Jewish learning and unlearning to mark the annual festival of Shavuot is returning. It will be taking place Saturday, May 31st through Sunday, June 1st, 8 p.m. to start, 8 p.m. to end, because it's 24 hours. And you can register at judaismunbound.com/Shavuot. That's judaismunbound.com/SHAVUOT. Hundreds of your friends are going to be there, and you may even get to see me super loopy after being up for 24 consecutive hours. That's many folks' favorite part of this program. This is our biggest Judaism Unbound event of our calendar year, so we hope to see you there. Also, we have some amazing classes in the Onion Yeshiva beginning in just a few days as this episode is being released. We've got Disability Torah and Spiritual Subversiveness with Julia Watts-Belzer, The Torah in the Tarot with Stav Appel, and Spirit Guides in Past Lives, Reincarnation in the Kabbalistic Imagination with Nathaniel Berman. They're all open for your registration, and you can sign up for them at judaismunbound.com/classes. Financial aid is, of course, available to anyone who needs it. And now a bit more about today's guest, Tirzah Firestone. Tirzah Firestone is a rabbi, author, psychotherapist, and leader in the international Jewish renewal movement. Widely known for her groundbreaking work on Kabbalah, on depth psychology, and reintegrating feminine wisdom into Judaism, Firestone lectures and teaches internationally about spiritual and ancient wisdom practices that are honed to assist us at this critical time in world history. Her latest work, Wounds into Wisdom, Healing Intergenerational Jewish Trauma, is the recipient of a 2020 Nautilus Book Award in Psychology and the Jewish Women's Caucus of the Association for Women in Psychology 2020 Book Award. That book, Wounds into Wisdom, is also the launching point for today's episode of Judaism Unbound. Tirzah Firestone is also the author of With Roots in Heaven, One Woman's Passionate Journey into the Heart of Her Faith, and other terrific books. Tirzah Firestone was ordained as a rabbi by Zalman Schachter Shalomi in 1992, and she is the founding rabbi of Congregation Neve Kodesh in Boulder, Colorado. She earned a master's degree in counseling at Beacon College in Boston and a doctorate in depth psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institution in Santa Barbara, California. Now Rabbi Emerita of her congregation, Tirzah Firestone maintains a private practice in depth psychology and teaches internationally on many topics. Tirzah Firestone, welcome to Judaism Unbound. We're so thrilled to have you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Great to be here.
Well, I wanted to start us off maybe in a very kind of basic way, but I hear in the Jewish community a lot that people talk about intergenerational trauma all the time, I'm traumatized, this, that. And I'm not sure they know what they're saying. So just for the sake of getting clear on our terminology, I wanted to start by asking you, first of all, what do we mean by trauma? A lot of people talk about trauma, but what is trauma really? What is it? What do we mean on a kind of even scientific level?
Great place to start. We use the word trauma probably too frequently. It's an important word, and we'll talk today about why it's so prominent in the public conversation because of the science that has become so popular in the last 15 to 20 years. But let's just say this, that trauma is simply a word that means wound. It comes from Greek. It is the residue of any deeply distressing life experience, psychologically, physically, that overwhelms our central nervous system's coping capacities. So when we cannot register any longer because things have violated our norms, we go into certain brain functions that put on hold who we are, where we are, in order just to function. It puts on hold our emotional response. My friend and teacher, Gabor Mate, says trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside you as a result of what happened to you. And we also, even in my own book, I'm culpable. They say healing intergenerational Jewish trauma. Well, the word healing from trauma is also perhaps used too loosely. Anyone who's lost a child, God forbid, or had their home burned down or has lived through a war knows that you never go back to the wholeness or the old self that you once were. So healing really isn't what we're after. We're after a new kind of integration or a new kind of wholeness. If you do the hard work, there's a kind of alchemy that happens in which the heavy metals of our suffering get transmuted into something new. You become a new person. So it's a little bit more kosher to say trauma integration rather than trauma healing.
I want to define the problem a little bit, because basically the idea is if we have two people and they face the same trigger, the same thing, it could be a loud noise, it could be an attack, whatever the issue might be that two different people are facing. If one of them is someone who has experienced trauma that is connected to that particular trigger, and one of them hasn't experienced trauma, they are likely to face that situation in two different ways, right? And I think that when we ask, and we're not even on the intergenerational part yet, I'm just talking about trauma that you yourself might have experienced,
right?
That each person, or tell me if this is right, like each person in their own mind will believe that their response to that trigger is the reasonable response, is the appropriate response. Everybody says, like, of course, everybody must respond this way. It makes all the sense in the world to me. And yet, I think we're saying, right, that the person who has trauma is actually not fully aware that their response is not only the most reasonable one to the situation. Or what's a better way to say all that?
Yes, the person who has unhealed or unprocessed history of trauma, and that means that they have some residues in their nervous system that will constellate an experience that's different from someone who does not have that history. If in the last 30 years, I experienced something that overwhelmed my coping capacities, and I haven't done the work of, I use the word metabolizing that nervous system response, then probably I'm going to have a residue that's going to set me up for a different kind of experience than you, who never went through what I did. But that also calls into question new research, which is that my nervous system matrix, if you will, also has other things besides my own trauma residue in it. It also carries the imprints or the evidence or the epigenetic residues of people who came before me. It's a complicated profile that each of us have.
Yeah. So for those who haven't read your book, one thing I really appreciated about it was, I don't want to say an oscillation. Like I want to talk about sort of the individual axis and the collective axis. And if I say oscillation, like you went back and forth between focusing on individuals who experienced trauma and Jewish collectivity and even some other collective traumas, that implies that they're two separate things and you're oscillating between them. I know that part of your point is that they're not, but I do want to bring in the collective here. I want to ask about sort of Jewish collective trauma, because I think it's sticky and complicated in a bunch of ways. I mean, just to speak from my personal experience, I am somebody who is a Jew by birth, so I did not convert to Judaism. My family is from Eastern Europe. In many ways, I'm kind of a more centered, more well-known kind of Jewish in the scheme of Jewish stories. That's a problem we've talked about on the show a lot, that we don't center other stories. But even as I am a European descended Ashkenazi Jew, I don't, for example, have direct connections in my family history to the Holocaust. I could look to my great grandparents' sort of cousin. Like I have some extended connections that I could find, but like when I experience a connection to the Holocaust and like in my body, I have certain senses of nervousness or anxiety that one might argue connect to Jewish history and even incorporate a few generations ago, the Holocaust. It's not that like my grandparents experienced it necessarily or great grandparents, but there are still ways in which, because I'm part of this Jewish collective, that affects me. And even for folks who are Jewish that don't descend from that area of the world, like this is part of our collectiveness, but it's complicated and murky. So I kind of want to ask you in the same way Dan did about like, what is trauma? What does it mean for Jews collectively to have forms of trauma? Because we obviously haven't all had the same family histories.
No, we haven't. And particularly, I do want to be careful that we're not being too Ashkenocentric. The truth is that Jews all over the world have had their own brand of discrimination for the last probably roughly 2,000 years. So it doesn't have to even be Holocaust. But what is collective trauma? For any ethnicity, for any group who has suffered an event or a series of events that shatters their experience of safety, a shared experience that alters the narrative, alters the psyche of our community. And psyche, I mean that, again, loosely, it's a Greek word that means soul. So the sort of the psychospiritual sense of identity, it alters that. When you're thinking of African Americans who were bound and shackled and brought over to be white people's slaves, or you could think about it in terms of indigenous peoples all over the world. When we're talking about Jews, for a variety of reasons, both objective and political, the Holocaust has been centered, looms large on the page of our collective Torah. Whether or not, I work with so many people who, yes, I think my parents or my great-grandparents may have suffered from the pogroms in Russia, but I don't even know if that's true. They came over in 1890 or 1909, whatever. But still, when I hear a German accent, still when I see a picture of a yellow star, I am triggered. So there is kind of an osmosis that happens within the collective of Jews. I would say probably among Middle Eastern Jews, it's less the Holocaust, maybe more the Farhud or the Moroccan riots or traumas that happen. Jews have been scapegoated for literally centuries. And that bleeds. It bleeds into a sense of unsafety and a sense of, do we really belong? These narratives about the shoe is always about to drop. We have to have a suitcase packed in our ready to go in our closet. Those kinds of memes or tropes are very global to our people.
Yeah. I remember having a personal kind of turning point moment with this when I realized, without having learned much about intergenerational Jewish trauma, I had just for many years in my backpack, I keep my passport in my backpack all the time. And whenever I travel anywhere, I have my passport in there. I also have my grandfather I have his Siddur that he used in his prayer book that he used in the Navy. I have a couple things that are in my backpack always. And I truly was just thinking of it in the way Dan was describing it. I was oh, it's just it's practical. If I face some situation, it might be good to have my passport. I thought it was not.
Yeah, I also do, by the way.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, I didn't think of that as some deep, oh, I'm nervous. I'm doing this because of anxiety or familial history or Jewish collective history. But then I learned that this is a thing that disproportionately a lot of Jews do and others are less likely to do. That's not to say that it's, uniquely something related to us, but it made me think and made me notice that about myself. And it didn't make me change that, by the way. I still have my passport in my back. I haven't seen that as like a huge, significant problem. I guess what I am curious about is to talk a little more about that osmosis that you described. I love the word osmosis because it contains Moses. So whenever we're talking about Jewish things flowing, osmosis. Anyway, that's my own pun brain. But there's particular ways that this kind of rears its head, and that's a negative connotation. There are other like safety focused ways that maybe one could argue this rears its head productively. But like you talk in your book about ways this manifests with respect to Israel, intermarriage. Like, what are some of the ways that we are channeling Jewish trauma, familial or otherwise? And, why might we want to notice?
Great question. But let me rewind for just a minute because, so central to our liturgy and to our whole ideology as Jews, listeners may know this, the words dor lador. It's such part of our infrastructure that from generation to generation, Nagid Gadlacha, we will sing your praises, God. We know your presence in our lives. So intergenerational legacies are it's inherent to Judaism. And we want to say before we launch into all the crazy neuroses that we have, we also want to say that there are very positive wisdom intergenerational legacies too. I mean, we wouldn't be here, honestly, if our ancestors hadn't been pretty darn savvy, street smart, resilient, because they were living under the gun or always ready to be displaced or converted or whatever, tortured. So we have this resilience. That's also an intergenerational legacy. That's also Midor Lador. But hand in glove with that comes I'll just say, I met a 10-year-old child, or the social worker of a 10-year-old child, who just in a little tiny example, he won't leave the house without packing his backpack, not with his passport, but with food. He won't go out of the house without being loaded down with food. So food is a thing for him. It's not his parents. It's not even his grandparents. His great-grandparents lived through the starvation in Ukraine, that the man-made starvation at the hands of the Russians. And he doesn't know a thing about it. Where the heck does that come from? That he has to sort of be on guard like that. So there are precious legacies and there are also neurotic legacies. And part of the whole Torah of ancestral healing, or intergenerational healing, as you might call it, is that we want to widen the lens on ourselves and see that that who we think we are, despite what our culture tells us, we're not solo acts here. We are part of a much bigger ancestral web work. And the unmetabolized trauma histories that were lived by our ancestors, whether or not we knew their names or knew anything about them, can filter down to us in many cases. And why we're even talking about this is because there is actual data that's coming out of the labs, studies that show us that there are these residues that come to us that make us more prone to PTSD, that make us more prone to anxiety, to scarcity, to fear, given a little bit more stress in your present tense life situation. If your ancestors, if your grandparents lived through something that was, and they couldn't have metabolized everything, processed everything, you may have more of a propensity for PTSD.
As I'm reflecting on this, when I pack a suitcase, I pack for contingencies. It might rain, it might not rain, it might this and that. Whereas my wife just packs very lightly, like whatever, she and if something happens, it happens. And it's funny because in my head, I think, well, I'm doing something rational. It's, it might rain, so I should take a raincoat. Right. And in my wife's head, she's doing something rational. She doesn't want her bag to be that heavy. And so if it rains, then she lost the bet. And, it's hard to think about whether these are just different approaches to reason or actually there's some trauma. And it might be a very minor trauma. Like I once, was on a trip and got rained on and said, that's never happening to me again, or something like that. And it's like, how do you kind of think about whether something is logical or trauma induced? And just to make it a more significant question, I'm thinking a lot about the talk post October 7th in the US about anti-Semitism. So I happen to be not particularly traumatized by anti-Semitism. Like that doesn't feel like a major source of trauma for me. And so when I look at the situation, I kind of say, yeah, sure, there's anti-Semitism. There are a lot of people in the world who don't like me, Dan. They just don't like me, but they don't want to kill me. So there's a difference between somebody not liking me and somebody wanting to kill me, right? And when I look at anti-Semitism, I say, look, I don't like the idea that there are people out there that say bad things about Jews or that wouldn't want to have us in their club. But that seems like a different order of anti-Semitism than, marauding Nazis on the street wanting to kill you. And yet it feels to me like some of the discourse about anti-Semitism in America today doesn't make a distinction between those two. And every statement that could be said to be anti-Semitic, even if it's not overt, seems to trigger the five-alarm fire response that says, oh my God, there's going to be another Holocaust. So therefore, we have to do everything that we can to smother that immediately. And that just feels like trauma to me.
It is absolutely a trauma residue. And what we're living in is it has been called like a post-October 7th, the trauma vortex, where we can't quite think rationally. And there's that bleeding out. Even for, kids like me, I grew up in St. Louis. I was never subject to any kind of anti-Semitic remarks, but it is alive in me when I see pictures or when I hear news. And that's exactly how trauma works. First of all, we have a predisposition, as I've just said. But whether or not we have a predisposition from earlier personal trauma or ancestral trauma makes for a situation where our central nervous system gets activated. We flip into a sympathetic modality where our rational brain that thinks things through logically, sequentially, with insight, with compassion, able to think in the larger context, those things which come from the front brain, the prefrontal cortex, go offline. So when we are triggered, because we've just read the newspaper or we've just listened to this horrendous report on October 7th or 8th or 9th, we get triggered into a modality in our nervous system, which is hypervigilant, hyper-aroused, which induces all kinds of trigger responses that we are not able to be thinking through that larger contextual lens. It literally goes offline. You can't think logically and be emotional at the same time. The two don't, that's the way we were built. I think some diaspora Jews who don't have that predisposition, despite the osmosis and all the cultural narrative that we might share, might have a little bit of a margin of error in a good way to the news. So whereas if I'm living in Israel and that attack happens on October 7th, it is so close, it is so in my face, there is so much hysteria abounding. And let's just also say that Israel in itself, because there are so many, it is a place, kibbutz galuyot, which means the ingathering of the exiles. So many people from around the world, whether they were from North Africa or Spain or South America, or have trauma history. So the country itself, anyway, the collective nervous system in Israel is a little bit heightened. And those of us who are across the ocean on Turtle Island might be more regulated to say, well, the occupation of 57 years or the 77-year-old narrative, I might be able to wax as a political analyst and say, I understand it in the context of XYZ. I would be coming from a different part of my brain, literally, than somebody who is triggered sympathetic nervous system that is so triggered that they can't think straight. This is a brain function. And in the book, in Wounds into Wisdom, I do weave back and forth between individual trauma and collective trauma, but basically they act very similarly.
On that front, I really do want to think about institutional Jewish policies, responses. Like, I want to think about the ways in which not only, the set of however many million Jews in the US and globally, like how we are channeling our various traumas. I want to think about how, like, there is not a huge barrier between common Jewish traumas and familial heritage and whatever, and like how we go about collective decision making in Jewish organizations. Like it seems that, like, I hope that doesn't sound like a big provocative statement. It just seems true that the fact of these collective traumas has very directly informed how Jewish institutions have gone about decision making. We could look at that in terms of how folks measure the anti-Semitism in the ways Dana was describing. We're ready to see anti-Semitism quickly. That might be good in moments where we need to. It might be problematic when we jump to that when something is not anti-Semitic.
Yes.
We're ready to presume certain kinds of behaviors in the world as dangerous that might not be. I mean, that's where the intermarriage piece that I brought, like, people talked about intermarriage, and you talked about your own father talking about intermarriage as giving Adolf Hitler a posthumous victory. When I say that to people, because I talk about this regularly, like, non-Jews actually don't get it at first. Like they don't know what that means. Like why would a Jew marrying somebody not Jewish have anything to do with the Holocaust? Like, it actually doesn't make sense to them. But when you've been like inculcated to see the Holocaust as an effort to erase not just like people, but sort of Judaism and Jewishness from the world, when people marry somebody who's not Jewish, there's all of these fears, not just traumas,
Yes.
fears, terrors that arise that there won't be a Judaism anymore.
That's right.
That is not just abstract, and it's not just happening in individuals who like feel the way they do about intermarriage. It's then being channeled into Jewish institutional policies. And so I'd love to hear like how that's happening and what we might want to be on guard for so that we can think about those policies differently.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you asking, how much does the existential threat, how much it becomes our central organizing principle? That has become the case, I think, so much so that it is leading us around by the nose. American institutions, Jewish institutions, there's a continuum all the way to Israel government, where that has become the clutch. We are not coming from our fully aware and awakened selves when we are always knee-jerking and not able to read between the lines and not able to take a breath, relax, and see the context for what it is. For instance, how many people have told us, have told you, or have told me, I feel like it's 1933 all over again. I feel like it's 1939. The truth is that while this feeling, it might feel like deja vu, we've never been here before, ever in Jewish history. The state of Israel, which is called the Jewish homeland, is a nuclear power. By any objective standard, Israel has one of the most sophisticated armies in the world. The military is backed and armed by the greatest global superpower. All of this collides with the narrative that is so deeply ingrained in us that we're perpetually hated, we're perpetually the underdogs. Now, there is plenty of data, the protocols of the elders of Zion. There are many, many attacks. There are many conspiracy theories, but we are no longer the sheep that are being led to slaughter, although we might feel like that. But these narratives are the product. Yeah, they're the product of objectifiable historical events. And these deep experiences don't evaporate. They live in our nervous system, but I have such funny stories from doing interfaith work that this is nothing. I'm going on a tangent here, but Christian ministers coming up to me afterwards and saying, did I say something wrong? It's like, why is everyone so jumpy? They're interrupting my sentences. I don't understand. And I say, no. That's the way we are. You're part of the family. We're just treating you like you're part of the family. Like, that's part of our cultural code, is that we tend to finish each other's sentences. We tend to interrupt each other, whereas in a Christian community, that might be seen as very bad behavior. But it's that hypervigilance, that wanting to be accepted, that wanting to get to the point and to get to the goal. One could certainly make an argument that it's precisely this kind of internalized victimhood and anxiety that has galvanized the extreme, what I would consider heavy-handed military policies in Palestine and Gaza and the West Bank, that kind of hypermuscularity that We cannot take a breath. We cannot exhale, cannot take a day to grieve, but must launch into the military option. That has become our strategy, that has become Israel's strategy. And then the American and diasporic institutions in lockstep right behind. That hypermuscularity, that kind of that hair trigger quality is a counterposition that is attempting to balance an unconscious, unworked, extreme vulnerability and victimhood.
But let's talk a little bit about how do you relate to somebody who is traumatized, who is acting according to their trauma, or the other responses? Because I remember in the early days after October 7th, it was clear they were saying this talking point. I mean, to call it a talking point is to reveal my attitude towards it. But people were saying that this is the worst single day of killing of Jews since the Holocaust. And I remember immediately I didn't like that talking point. And I think in my mind, there were two or three reasons that I didn't like it. One, I said, I thought all the Holocaust scholars and experts were always telling us never compare anything to the Holocaust. So why all of a sudden is it okay to compare this to the Holocaust? So number one, that was inconsistent. Number two, it felt like, well, that might be true in the sense that 1,200 people were killed and there was no day that 1,200 Jews were killed since the Holocaust. That might be technically true, but it's not a particularly helpful comparison. In the Holocaust, 6 million Jews were killed, and on October 7th, 1,200 Jews were killed. Those are at a different order of magnitude. Subsequently to that, somebody said to me, the real problem with that comparison is that the right way to address somebody who has trauma is to help them not have their trauma reaction triggered. And if you think of the Jews as these people who are appropriately traumatized over the Holocaust, which was just millions and millions of people killed, not to mention all of Jewish history with lots of killings and destructions and all of that, it would be natural to imagine that those people are going to react out of trauma to much lesser triggers. And so if there is a lesser trigger, albeit, of course, a most horrifying one, but it's still not the Holocaust, you shouldn't trigger their intergenerational traumatic memories of the Holocaust. It would be better to say, this was the most terrible thing that has happened in our lifetimes, but leave it at that. Don't make the comparison to the Holocaust. So I'm wondering, what is the appropriate way to deal with situations that happen to us as Jews, understanding that we do have this intergenerational trauma?
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to answer that question in terms of psychology. I'm a psychotherapist. So when I work with someone who is highly traumatized, the long arc is to help them to first create a context of safety, assuring them that they are safe enough to face the losses and the humiliation, the demoralization that they've endured, to help them grieve the losses and the horror, to help them go deeply into their pain and vulnerability without acting it out on others. We could say that is a one-on-one approach, but it also stands to reason, just as you're saying, Dan, that there were in the heat of post-October 7th, there were calm voices, international voices that said, okay, let's take a breath here. Let's not launch into the mistakes that were made post 9/11. Let's learn from historical mistakes. Let's feel, I want you to feel, we want you to feel ensconced. You have moral capital here. Israel has the whole world was available to Israel during those first hours and days. Everyone was glued to hearing, how could this have happened? So many other options could have been taken. However, with trauma and trauma residue, there is no choice. It is a knee-jerk situation. We go right, boom. There is only one choice, and that's defense. It is because it's an existential threat. We have to defend ourselves at any cost, at any lengths. And that's exactly what happened. Israel acted out of its extreme trauma response, out of hypervigilance and that hyperarousal that comes out of the nervous system, not out of any kind of thought through, insightful strategy.
Well, it's also so interesting to hear you describe that, because I bet that a lot of listeners will say, that's not how I remember things, right? I remember that as soon as October 7th happened, there were all these people celebrating and all these people that were against Israel. But I remember it the same way that you remember it, which was in the early days after October 7th, there was a tremendous amount of support, tremendous amount of a sense that a horrible thing had happened. And of course, there were a few voices, more than a few, there were voices out there that celebrated.
Oh, yes.
But the Jewish community's response seemed to be immediately to focus in on the smaller number of voices that were celebrating, and to almost as if you didn't hear all the people that were expressing support. And then when Israel attacked Gaza, and then there was a lot of protesting against Israel, at that point, it was what they had all feared, right? It was what they thought was, what they thought was happening after
Right.
October 7th that wasn't happening. It did happen a month later.
That's
But
right.
now they've remembered the whole story, that there was never a moment after October 7th where there was an outpouring of support. And
That's
that's
right.
how that story is going to be remembered. And it's so tragic.
And, we see what will corroborate our own narrative constantly. And let's also be careful here, because there really is very serious and severe objective anti-Semitism out there. I don't want to be painted in any way that our conversation is naive in any way. That really is. But yes, where do we put our focus? That takes us to another little limb on the tree, which is you can also exploit trauma. You can use it to your benefit, to your political benefit too. It is very powerful to say that October 7th is just a continuation of the Nazi horror. And that puts forward your political agenda to go in there and bring down tens of thousands of Palestinians. It can become another kind of corroboration that is used for your own particular self-interest and gains.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is so important to name that there's lots of anti-Semitism around us, and that the point of this conversation is not to say that it doesn't exist and that it's all just ancestral trauma lying to us. Part of my struggle is that I think that in focusing on certain things that we think might look like anti-Semitism, we're actually missing some of the others that endanger us just as much or more. For example, in the last bunch of months, we've observed as the Trump administration has actually done a lot of talking about fighting anti-Semitism. That's actually like that they use that language a lot. And then you look at the things they're doing. I mean, I saw somebody share yesterday, here's a list of Jewish studies projects that were funded by the NEH that had the grants pulled. The grants were terminated. These were studies related to the Holocaust in some cases, studies related to Jews. Like, you don't cut a bunch of projects that are designed to study Jewish history and culture and even anti-Semitism if your goal is to fight anti-Semitism. They're using that framing of, we are fighting anti-Semitism. That is something that they usually mean they're fighting sort of the left on campus that has been painted by many different folks as anti-Semitic, as anti-Israel, as all of these things. I think none of us in this conversation would deny that there are some voices that are anti-Semitic. We would also say that there's really scary voices allied with Trump in his own administration that we would be just as scared of and maybe much more scared of. So like part of my frustration is that I think we channel this incorrectly. But the other question I have, I do want to think about like our Jewish calendar. Peter Beinart was on our show not too long ago, and he talked about how there's this meme in Jewish life, and I don't just mean like an internet meme, like there's a thing shared across Jewish life of every Jewish holiday. It's about they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat.
Oh, yeah.
That's not true. Like you look at all of the Jewish holidays, there are a lot of them that don't fit that. But what's happening when we share that meme is we are making a narrative choice. We're making a story choice to distill our entire calendar into a particular framework of eternal victimhood. Sukkot, Shavuot, Tu B'Shvat, I'm naming a bunch of holidays. Like, they have nothing to do with people trying to kill us and then eating, but we have actually deprioritized those holidays for the sake of holidays like a Hanukkah, like a Purim, like a Passover, and more recently, like the days related to Israel, Yom HaTzmaut, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Day. Like, we have made choices to prioritize holidays that are about that victimhood. And so I guess I'm wondering, like, how can we do that less, or how can we better focus on our anti-Semitism stuff?
Yeah, you're reminding me of a time when Wounds into Wisdom came out, and I had the honor of appearing with Gloria Steinem, who was a big backer of the book. We were at the 92nd Street Y in New York, and a young Israeli woman stood up and she said, "I'm so sick of it. Has anyone here noticed that Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day, and the Yom HaZikaron, the Israel Memorial Day, and then Yom HaAtzmaut, the Israel Independence Day, that they all follow lockstep one after the other, and it's orchestrated just so to tell a certain narrative that we're always victims." And then she went on to talk about how young Israelis are taken to Auschwitz, and then right before the Independence Day, they're brought back to, she said it is an orchestration to tell a certain narrative that we were the victims and the promised land was waiting for us, and it didn't have anyone living there. And her question was, how do we preserve the important history lessons and the memory and the memory of all the people who died without re-traumatizing ourselves and without exploiting it again and again? And so often, because my work is about the ancestors and really listening, putting our ear to the ground and listening to what they would have said. What would they be saying now? The old myths can be very, very toxic and keep us locked in. That old myth of they came to kill us, we've got to survive at any cost, now let's eat, that triad joke that we tell and laugh about is a toxic myth. It's not actually true. And it has given us moral permission to excoriate an entire people, that existential threat that is beefed up more and more and more, so that there is never a possibility for diplomatic interaction. No, they're not all terrorists. No, they do not all want to kill us. Yes, there actually are people who that might be leaders that could need us to take our future, to reimagine a future that is more sane and not built upon war. But the old trauma narratives keep us very, very stuck.
I remember, I think we've talked about this before on the podcast, when in the early days of Israel's war in Gaza, there was some notion that, they wanted to, the IDF wanted to clear out parts of Gaza at a time, and then get rid of the Hamas people and destroy the infrastructure, whatever. So they said, we're going to have all the populations move to a different place, and then we'll, and I remember saying to them, like, I understand that in your mind, this is somehow a nice thing to do, right? Because you're trying to get the people out so that they won't be killed as collateral damage while you fight Hamas or while you destroy the infrastructure. But you don't understand the Palestinians' great trauma is the Nakba, that they were evicted from their land. So, well, for Jews, the worst thing that we can think of is being killed. For Palestinians, the worst thing that they can think of is being displaced. And so you're about to trigger their worst trauma.
That's right.
In an effort to be, quote, nice, but you don't know them. And what's happening now, the great tragedy with Israel and Palestine is that they seem to be, dead set on triggering one another's greatest traumas. And that seems to be like so the opposite of something that could possibly lead to a resolution. And it's not because, I think a lot of times I remember back in the days of the Oslo Accords, everybody was like, well, the resolution's obvious. So, why do we even have to negotiate? Like, it's so clear what it's going to be in the end. So why is this taking so long? And I think the answer is because these are two traumatized peoples. And so just having reason isn't actually the basis for the solutions. But the question is, like, what is the basis? Like, how do you help a person that has been traumatized? And I guess the question is, like, as a psychologist, right, how do you help one person? And that's really interesting. And yet I think a lot of us have a sense, we've been in therapy, whatever, that we have a sense of how individual people are helped to recover from trauma or to heal from trauma. But how are nations helped to heal from trauma?
In Wounds into Wisdom, I distill what some very, very brave people who have gone through horrible tragedies, Jews from around the world, say about this. How do you get through it? You get through it by facing into your losses and harnessing the power of your pain, finding new community, resisting that demand by society to fear and blame and dehumanize, and the chosenness, the specialness narrative. All of those are true for individuals and for entire collectives. But I would say that you need a third side. William Ury, the great international mediator, he had a book called The Third Side, that you need someone from the outside who is not triggered, someone who can see the pain of one side and the pain of the other to reframe the situation. That has got to be from people who are not coming from this trauma residue place that we've been discussing, perhaps an international forum. But you have to be able to hit your bottom line and see this is going to be suffering ad infinitum. This is not going to ever cease. It feels good. It feels right. It feels vanquishing to take vengeance and be in the retribution phase. And that gives the nervous system a great high. But ultimately, you are going to wreak havoc on your own selves. It's not going to be sustainable.
So I really appreciate the ways you're helping us think through so many things. I mean, I feel like in many ways this episode is turning into like a check-in for our show generally. Like, we haven't had an episode about, hey, intergenerational Jewish trauma. But we have had a number of units where it's like, oh, let's look at Jewish education. Turns out the ways we do Jewish education are actually deeply sculpted around fear and trauma and the notion that Jews are going to all assimilate and leave and not be Jewish anymore. And so we mold our systems to fit that. Oh, intermarriage. Turns out that we have this as like a super core essential communal issue because of a set of things that we might not be operating with fully sort of rational mind, but we might be operating from a reactive place. Like, and on that latter point, I really do want to go to you because a particular issue of importance to me and to this show historically has been not only sort of the existence of Jews in interfaith relationships in Jewish life, but their leadership. And because I'm in an interfaith relationship myself, I'd say our leadership. You are part of that story. And so this is like, I'm inspired by you. And so this is kind of a selfish question, but I think a lot of our listeners to be in a Zoom conversation with the first person, as far as I can find in any like historical documentation, the first person in like modern contemporary times to be ordained as a rabbi while in an interfaith relationship. I mean, you hinted to us before we started talking that even as you were a rabbi, there were ruptures in your family related to your intermarriage. But I'd love, to whatever extent you're comfortable, if you could like give us a window into the ways in which on that issue in particular, we have hit roadblocks in the past. And I guess because I think it still rears its head, as much as, we've seen as certain rabbinical schools have changed their policies. And now it is Baruch Hashem, like, thank God, it is possible for people in interfaith relationships to become leaders of Jewish life in deeper ways. I still think that this is operating for a lot of people. And so I'd love to hear your past and present relationship to that.
Absolutely. No, this was a big segment of my life. I was raised in a very Orthodox post-war household. My father was a Baal Tshuva. That means he was a born-again Jew. He was stationed in Bergen-Belsen when it was liberated. And so what he saw was incredibly traumatizing. He came back just with a vengeance that he wanted to live a Jewish life and that Hitler would not have the victory and that his kids would be, damn it, strong Jews and they would increase the Jewish numbers, etc. My mom was actually a refugee from Germany, escaped Nazi Germany in 1939. So she, this was a perfect Velcro relationship, right? And the six of us were raised in that kind of extremely Orthodox and strict patriarchal, good Jewish education. There are a lot of great things about my upbringing, but that was drilled into us. It was really quite, for me, stifling. And as soon as I could leave home, I did. And I traveled the world, went on an odyssey, studied every possible thing, and ended up giving up Judaism completely and marrying a Christian minister who had a very alive relationship to his tradition and to Jesus. It was really alive. And he had studied in seminary with Maurice Friedman, and he had studied Buber, and he had studied with Heschel. He knew the vitality in the inner core of Judaism much more than I did, because it had been, my experience was that it was stuffed down my throat. It was due to that relationship, falling in love with that person, that I ultimately revisited my Judaism and ended up meeting Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi of blessed memory and becoming a rabbi, being ordained while I was still married. But in the process of marrying this man who changed my life, and I'm no longer married to him, I was disowned by my family, completely disowned, and I was dead. So I had a special in to the interfaith community. I understood it from the inside, the pain, the alienation, the sense of exclusion, the sense of exile that so many Jews that I was meeting, and ultimately in my young rabbinate, were coming to me with so much pain. Like, why is this so hard? What, like pulling out their hair? Like, what's going on here? And that was really the beginning of understanding this was so much bigger than just interfaith marriage. It was really, you were killing out, for many of these families, you were killing out the possibility of, this was a Jewish assimilation, was the big boogeyman word in those days. So yes, this was a big part of my early ministry, my early rabbinate.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like, as just an example, like there's still a lot of people out there in the world that are against intermarriage, and perhaps even to that extreme level, like they think it's a posthumous victory for Hitler, or, it's an existential threat or whatever, but much fewer than there were at that time. And part of me wonders, like, how do the people who were so sure that that was an existential threat back then listen to this conversation now? Because what they really should say is, yeah, I had trauma. Like, I was having a trauma reaction back then. And somehow now, either because I've changed, I'm no longer feeling that trauma for whatever reason, or I've just been watching the world and I've seen, back then they were saying anybody who's intermarried obviously doesn't even want to be Jewish. And now it turns out all these people want to be rabbis. Like, I must have been wrong, right? That whole conception must have been wrong. So maybe those people can look back on that and reflect and say, how could I have been so against it back then? How could I have been so scared of it back then? It must have been trauma. But I'm saying that there are people out there that are listening right now that 40 years ago were extremely against intermarriage, and now they are not. I know some of these people. And my question is, like, what are they thinking? How do they think about it?
And many of them have kids who went off to marry non-Jews who became even more Jewish.
Right.
We don't know how this thing is going to evolve. But one thing that's true about our tradition is it keeps reinventing itself. It keeps changing. It has survived through so many iterations because of its adaptability and its ability to be flexible and include non-members and include new innovative thinking and include something that is considered completely ridiculous and, not salient or out of the margins becomes central 10 years later. So we keep recreating ourselves, and that's the beauty of it. And so many of the non-Jews who have been brought in have become board presidents, have become mothers and fathers of Jewish kids, have enriched the next generations.
So the question I want to ask you, though, is like, okay, let's give an alternative example. Let's say we're talking about somebody who, when they were a kid, their parents were part of the Madoff Ponzi scheme and lost all their money. And so this kid grew up in penury, and their response to that is a trauma response, which says, I'm never investing any of my money. I'm going to put it all in cash and hide it under my mattress. So you can understand that. And also, we do want people to learn from the Madoff Ponzi scheme. So in other words, we don't want to say like, oh, that was just one thing that happened. Don't worry about it. You should just invest your money everywhere. Like that person actually has an advantage because they will be more wary to make sure that they're not taken advantage of. But the extreme trauma reactions say, I'm never going to invest my money and I'm going to put it under the mattress. And that gives up the possibility of investing it in like, Apple stock or something and becoming like a bazillionaire. And what we're saying here about the Jews, and what we're saying here too, what you just said about the intermarried folks who, maybe one of them will become the greatest rabbi. We were talking with one right here. But the idea is saying that if your reaction is the trauma response to say, I'm going to be so vigilant that I'm going to make 100% sure that this never happens to me again, then you are giving up the upside potential of the possibility of that big investment. But at the same time, we don't want to minimize it and say to people, pretend there's no anti-Semitism, pretend there was never any Holocaust. So what is that Goldilocks zone?
Critical thinking is one of the jewels of an awake mind. Critical thinking, to be able to take all the ingredients, all the factors, and look to see, and where do I weigh in on that? Not to be ruled by fear, however. Yes, these things there's a lot of frightening pieces of our history. There's very frightening things happening right now as we speak. Am I allowing myself to use my critical thinking, my critical faculties, which come from the front brain, not my limbic lava, as I call it, the sort of the volcanic, oh my God, it's another existential threat, fear and insecurity and unsafety and anxiety. When those things rule me, I am not thinking correctly. And so you're asking a very nuanced question. And for each of us, we have to do the work of coming clear on when do I feel my clearest? Part of that process is to know what lives inside of me. Do I have ancestral trauma? Do I have personal trauma that I need to grieve, that I need to really look at? Because if I don't, that's going to be in my driver's seat. I'm not going to be in my driver's seat. It will be. Mm-hmm. And it will make decisions for me.
So thank you again. I have a closing question. And what I'm curious about, so as this episode is being released, we are in the midst of this, I think, really glorious, beautiful time period in the Jewish flow of time. We're in the Omer. And in a couple weeks, we will be arriving at the mountain, at Mount Sinai, for Shavuot, for this incredible day of receiving revelation. I have noticed in myself for a while, I mean, people have heard me on this podcast talk about some of my holidays that I love the most, and Shavuot is my favorite holiday. And in recent years, I've noticed that the holidays I like the most are not bogged down in somebody trying to kill us, we survived, let's eat. Like Shavuot really doesn't have that DNA. It's this story of receiving revelation at Mount Sinai, or maybe receiving 10 Commandments.
Arguably, God tried to kill us.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, the Talmud says that. That's true. But like, it's separate from that, and I think that's part of why I like it. Not because I'm antagonistic to holding Jewish pain and trauma. I actually think it is a healthy thing that we have certain days in the calendar to hold deep pain and trauma, because otherwise they just sort of blur into all time, and that's not good. My question to you, maybe your answer will be related to Shavuot in particular or the Omer, but maybe it won't. How do we actualize the teachings of your book? How do we think and channel trauma differently through like actual Jewish calendrical ritual moments? Like what's a step that you can think of? What's a something that we might collectively benefit from if we do X intervention during the Omer or Shavuot or during the rest of the year? How might we actually take this to reality? Because for a lot of us, we're aware that trauma is floating around in different ways. But other than the conversations with a therapist and occasional reactivity, we don't have the positive channels and the ritualized channels all the time.
Beautiful. Oh, I love talking to you guys. For me, the answer is Shavuot. And because it's a little harder to grasp, you know how we gravitate toward the blood and guts violent movies as a culture, right? It's like it's all about war and vengeance and getting back. And no, it's not that. It's much more subtle. It's much more impressionistic. Shavuot is about direct spiritual experience. And everything we're talking about for the last hour or so has been what detours us from that, from what we're supposed to be, which is channels for light, agents of blessing in the world. I'm not saying that we're the only ones that do that, but certainly that's one of our mandates, is to be in the world and put off light. And we've been talking about what keeps us in retaliation and in anxious mind and all of that. That's the detour. But if we come back to your question, Shavuot is about Torah that is being given every minute, the Bat Kol, prophetic voice that's inside of us speaking at every minute. If we can tune into it, if we are calm enough and have the equanimity, have the kind of balance, and we're attuned to ourselves, we can start living into some of our tradition's prophetic principles, which are all about care and empathy and love. It's about love, loving the alien, the person who's strange in the world, but inside of ourselves, reaching out, creating zones of love in this world. Ancestral healing, we call it, or intergenerational healing, is to help create a zone where we're slowing down and connecting with the neshamot, the souls of wise and well ancestors, the spiritual allies, the leaders, the people who we have emulated in our lives, our rebbes, our third grade teacher, our bubbies, zadies, it doesn't matter who that is, someone on the other side who is expressive of the highest, most beautiful, loving qualities of our families, of our tradition, who are still shining their lights. There's, whether or not you believe in an afterlife, whether or not you believe that they're really there, just thinking about someone who is a great, righteous, in the true sense of the word, person. We could do that right now for just 1 minute to invite in the face and the presence of one person we have known, or maybe not even known, someone we adored and who maybe we feel is a great person who loved us or would love us if they knew us. Suspend our disbelief and extend our imagination to see who that might be. Always my Rebbe Reb Zalman comes, but also I have a grandmother who comes and a cousin who died young. These are beings that I bring into my quiet places and I ask them questions. How should I behave? What should I do? Invariably, I get deep love and good counsel. It's one of my practices. So I do believe that our ancestors, our avot and imahot, as we say in Hebrew, are alive in us. Our tradition teaches us that they are alive. They live in us, and we can invoke them for wisdom and for help, especially in times like we're living in now.
Amen. Thank you so much, Tirzah Firestone, for joining us and for blessing us with that closing offering. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It's been a joy.
And thanks, of course, to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again with us in the future. We've got a couple reminders before we close things out. First, Shavuot Live, our annual pinnacle event. Pinnacle like top of the mountain, because we're climbing up the mountain to receive Torah, broadly defined, revelation. That's coming up May 31st at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. We will be having our annual 24-hour extravaganza of Jewish learning and unlearning. It will be happening in Zoom. You can come no matter where you are and no matter what your schedule in life, because there's 24 hours available for you to attend. Come for 45 minutes, come for 3 hours, come for the whole 24, whatever you'd like. You can register by heading to our website, judaismunbound.com/Shavuot, that's SHAVUOT, or you can go to bit.ly/2025Shavuot. Either of those will work for you to register. Also, we have Yeshiva classes starting in just a few days. We have 3-week mini courses that are coming up. We've got Torah in the Tarot with Stav Appel, also Disability Torah and Spiritual Subversiveness with Julia Watts-Belser, and Spirit Guides and Past Lives, a class about reincarnation in Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, with Nathaniel Berman. All of those are coming up soon, so head to judaismunbound.com/classes to register. Financial aid is available. Shavuot Live, by the way, fully free. So those are a few reminders. We also just want to encourage you to be in touch with us with any questions, visions, ideas, comments built off of today's episode or any of our others. You can be in touch in any of the following ways. There's our Facebook and Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. You can head to our website, judaismunbound.com, and check out show notes for this episode and lots of other goodies. And you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. We're also greatly appreciative if you're able to support us financially with either a monthly recurring gift or a one-time donation, and you can do either of those at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.